Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are uncovering a chapter of American history so dark, so deeply buried, and so morally bankrupt that it almost feels like the plot of a dystopian thriller. But I assure you, every single agonizing detail we are going to discuss today is absolutely true. Imagine a scenario where the United States federal government decides that a minor, non-violent offense should be punishable by a terrifying, agonizing death. Imagine that this penalty is carried out without a trial, without a jury, without a judge, and without any due process whatsoever. Imagine that the weapon of mass execution is secretly slipped into something that millions of everyday citizens consume on a daily basis. We are talking about the deliberate, systematic poisoning of the American alcohol supply during Prohibition, a government-mandated initiative that directly caused the agonizing deaths of at least 10,000 American citizens. Let that number sink in for a moment. 10,000 Americans killed by their own government. This was not collateral damage. This was not a tragic accident. This was a calculated, deliberate choice.
It truly defies belief. When we think of Prohibition, we usually picture speakeasies, flappers dancing the Charleston, underground jazz clubs, and glamorous gangsters running illicit liquor empires in Chicago and New York. We think of it as a failed social experiment, perhaps a bit of a chaotic time, but ultimately a colorful, romanticized era of American history. We rarely, if ever, think of it as an era of state-sponsored mass murder. But from a purely historical and factual standpoint, that is exactly what it was. The government, completely frustrated by its inability to enforce the Volstead Act and stop the American public from drinking, decided to take extreme, lethal measures. They turned industrial alcohol into a weapon of mass destruction. They authorized federal chemists to create increasingly toxic formulas, intentionally adding deadly poisons like methanol, benzene, and iodine to the alcohol supply. They knew precisely what these chemicals would do to the human body. They knew people were drinking this alcohol, and they proceeded anyway. They enforced a moral crusade with poison, and the psychological justification for this is just as horrifying as the act itself. The officials in charge, men who considered themselves righteous defenders of morality, essentially argued that anyone who chose to break the law and take a drink deserved what happened to them. They viewed these 10,000 deaths not as a tragedy, but as a deterrent. They viewed the mass blinding of thousands more not as a public health crisis, but as a necessary evil to win their war on alcohol. Today, we are going to break down exactly how this happened. We are going to look at the exact chemical formulas the government created, the desperate and brilliant bootlegger chemists who fought back by trying to wash the poison out, the heroic medical examiners who tried to sound the alarm, and the massive 80-year cover-up that followed. This is the story of how the United States government became the most prolific serial killer of the 1920s. To understand how the government reached the point of mass poisoning, we have to go back to the beginning of Prohibition and understand the mechanics of the alcohol industry at the time. When the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, it banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. However, it did not ban alcohol entirely. Alcohol was and still is a crucial industrial chemical. It is used in manufacturing paints, solvents, medical supplies, cosmetics, and thousands of other everyday products. To ensure that this industrial alcohol was not secretly diverted into the underground drinking market, the government required that it be denatured. Denaturing is a process where chemicals are added to pure alcohol to make it undrinkable. Before Prohibition, denaturing usually meant adding something that simply tasted foul or induced vomiting, like a heavy dose of soap or a mild emetic. It was unpleasant, but it was not designed to kill you.
Exactly. But the bootleggers of the 1920s were highly motivated and incredibly resourceful. The underground demand for liquor was absolutely insatiable, and the profits were astronomical. Since they could no longer legally distill their own drinking alcohol without drawing massive attention from federal agents, they turned to the millions of gallons of industrial alcohol that were still being legally produced. Crime syndicates set up massive, sophisticated shadow operations. They would steal industrial alcohol or buy it through dummy corporations, and then they would employ their own underground chemists to renature it. This process was known as washing. The bootlegger chemists would use redistillation, filtration through charcoal, and various chemical treatments to strip out the soap, the emetics, and the foul-tasting additives. Once the industrial alcohol was washed, it was mixed with water, flavored with juniper oil to make fake gin, or caramel color to make fake whiskey, and sold in speakeasies across the country. And for the first few years of Prohibition, this cat-and-mouse game was largely non-lethal. The bootleggers were stealing industrial alcohol, washing it, and selling it. The federal government would catch wind of how they were doing it, and they would order the industrial manufacturers to use a slightly more difficult denaturing formula. The bootleggers would then figure out a new way to wash it. It was an escalating battle of chemistry. By the mid-1920s, however, the government was losing this battle badly. It was estimated that over 60 million gallons of industrial alcohol were being stolen and diverted into the drinking supply every single year. The Volstead Act was becoming a national joke. Millions of Americans were drinking illicit liquor, violent crime syndicates were making billions of dollars, and the Prohibition Bureau was looking completely incompetent. The political pressure from temperance organizations, specifically the immensely powerful Anti-Saloon League, reached a boiling point. They demanded that the government take drastic action to stop the diversion of industrial alcohol, no matter the cost. And this is where the story takes its dark, horrific turn. Frustrated, embarrassed, and driven by a fanatical moral absolutism, the Treasury Department, which oversaw prohibition enforcement, decided that simply making the alcohol taste bad was no longer enough. If the bootleggers could wash out the foul-tasting chemicals, the government needed to add chemicals that were either impossible to remove or absolutely lethal if consumed. They decided to weaponize the industrial alcohol supply. In 1926, the federal government officially mandated the use of new, highly toxic denaturing formulas. They instructed industrial manufacturers to add poisons that were specifically chosen for their lethality and their similarity to ethyl alcohol, making them incredibly difficult for bootlegger chemists to separate through standard distillation. The era of mild emetics was over. The era of state-sponsored poisoning had begun. The most notorious of these new government-mandated formulas was known as Formula 3A. The primary active ingredient in Formula 3A was methyl alcohol, commonly known as wood alcohol. Now, it is absolutely critical to understand the biological difference between the alcohol people drink, which is ethyl alcohol, and methyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol is intoxicating, but the human liver can process it relatively safely in moderation. Methyl alcohol, on the other hand, is a deadly neurotoxin. When a human being ingests methyl alcohol, the liver metabolizes it using an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. But instead of breaking it down into harmless byproducts, the liver converts methyl alcohol into formaldehyde, the exact same highly toxic chemical used to embalm dead bodies. The formaldehyde is then rapidly metabolized into formic acid. Formic acid is essentially an industrial solvent. Once inside the bloodstream, it attacks the cells directly, destroying their ability to use oxygen. The body literally suffocates on a cellular level.
The physical effects of this process are nothing short of agonizing. Symptoms typically do not appear for 12 to 24 hours after drinking the poisoned alcohol, giving the victim a false sense of security. But once the formic acid begins to build up, the nightmare begins. It starts with severe nausea, violent vomiting, and excruciating abdominal pain that victims described as feeling like they had swallowed shattered glass and battery acid. As the acidosis worsens, the victim begins to hyperventilate as their body desperately tries to expel the acidic buildup. But the most terrifying trademark of methanol poisoning is what it does to the eyes. Formic acid has a specific, devastating affinity for the optic nerve. It destroys the nerve cells, leading to blurred vision, the sensation of looking through a severe snowstorm, and finally, permanent, irreversible blindness. If the dose is high enough, the victim falls into a coma as their central nervous system shuts down, followed by respiratory failure and death. And the government knew all of this. They knew exactly how agonizing this death was. They knew it intimately, yet they doubled down. By the end of 1926, the government mandated that up to 10% of all industrial alcohol must be completely composed of this deadly wood alcohol. And almost immediately, the bodies began to pile up. The defining moment, the moment when the sheer scale of this atrocity became undeniable public knowledge, occurred during the Christmas season of 1926. The holidays were a time of massive illegal liquor consumption. Bootleggers rushed millions of gallons of recently stolen, poorly washed industrial alcohol into the speakeasies of New York City to meet the holiday demand. They did not realize that the government had drastically increased the methanol content.
On Christmas Eve, the emergency room at Bellevue Hospital in New York City began to fill with patients screaming in agony, clutching their stomachs and begging for help because they were going blind. By Christmas Day, the hospital was overwhelmed. Patients were dying in the hallways. Over that single holiday weekend in New York City alone, more than 60 people died from government-poisoned alcohol, and dozens more were permanently blinded. The chief medical examiner of New York City at the time was a man named Dr. Charles Norris, a pioneer in forensic science. Working alongside his brilliant chief toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, Norris performed autopsy after autopsy on the victims. Gettler's sophisticated chemical analysis confirmed what Norris already suspected. These people were not dying from standard alcohol poisoning. They were dying from massive, lethal doses of methanol, benzene, and cadmium. Norris was absolutely horrified. He was a man of science and medicine, and he was witnessing a man-made public health catastrophe orchestrated by the federal government. Norris immediately went to the press. He held press conferences, he wrote blistering editorials, and he explicitly called the government's policy an act of mass murder. He stated unequivocally that the government knew this alcohol was being consumed, and by poisoning it, they were directly responsible for every single death. But the government's response to Norris's outcry was chillingly indifferent. Instead of halting the program, they defended it. Wayne B. Wheeler, the powerful head of the Anti-Saloon League and the primary political architect of Prohibition enforcement, gave statements that essentially blamed the victims. Wheeler argued that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was a deliberate suicide, and that the government had no moral obligation to protect citizens who willfully broke the law. The Treasury Department essentially shrugged its shoulders, claiming they were just protecting industrial property. They even escalated the chemical warfare. When bootlegger chemists figured out complex fractional distillation methods to remove the methanol, the government introduced even more insidious poisons. They added chloroform, iodine, zinc, and mercury salts. They added kerosene and brucine. They created a chemical cocktail so complex and so heavily bonded to the alcohol molecules that no underground bootlegger could possibly purify it. The explicit goal was to make the alcohol so lethally toxic that the fear of death would finally stop the American public from drinking. The tragic reality, however, is that the fear of death did not stop the drinking. Addiction, social pressure, and the deeply ingrained culture of alcohol consumption were far stronger than the fear of a poisoned bottle. Millions of people continued to drink, and the death toll skyrocketed. Charles Norris tried desperately to track the national numbers, but because so many deaths were misclassified as natural causes or simple intoxication, the exact count was difficult to verify at the time. However, modern historical and toxicological analysis estimates that between 1926 and the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, at least 10,000 American citizens were killed directly by government-poisoned alcohol. And that number only accounts for the fatalities. It does not include the tens of thousands of Americans who survived the poison but were left permanently blind, paralyzed, or suffering from severe neurological and organ damage for the rest of their lives. Entire communities, particularly impoverished immigrant communities who could only afford the cheapest, most toxic bootleg liquor, were devastated. What makes the aftermath of this tragedy even more infuriating is the complete lack of accountability. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, the national nightmare of the Volstead Act ended. People celebrated in the streets, breweries reopened, and the legal, regulated alcohol industry resumed. But amidst the celebration, the 10,000 victims of the government's poison program were quickly and quietly forgotten. There were no congressional investigations into the Treasury Department's actions. There were no criminal charges filed against the federal chemists who mixed the lethal formulas, nor against the politicians who authorized them. Wayne B. Wheeler and the leaders of the Anti-Saloon League faced no repercussions for explicitly endorsing the deaths of thousands of citizens. The government simply stopped adding the lethal poisons to industrial alcohol, swept the massive pile of bodies under the historical rug, and moved on as if nothing had ever happened. The mass poisoning was rationalized away as an unfortunate byproduct of a chaotic era. The prevailing narrative written into the history books was that bootleggers were solely responsible for the bad liquor, completely erasing the documented fact that the federal government was the original source of the lethal toxins. It was a masterpiece of historical gaslighting. It took decades for investigative journalists, historians, and toxicologists to dig through the archives, analyze the old medical examiner reports from heroes like Charles Norris, and finally piece together the full, horrifying truth. They uncovered the memos, the formula mandates, and the absolute proof that this was a deliberate, top-down federal policy. Yet even today, this staggering crime remains largely unknown to the general public. We learn about Al Capone and Eliot Ness in school, but we are never taught about the 10,000 citizens executed by their own government for the crime of taking a drink. The story of the Prohibition poisonings stands as one of the most chilling examples of what happens when a government becomes so blinded by a moral crusade that it completely loses its humanity. It is a terrifying testament to the dangers of absolutism, demonstrating how easily state power can be violently turned against the very citizens it is sworn to protect. The officials who authorized this program genuinely believed they were fighting a righteous war for the soul of the nation, and in their fanaticism, they justified the mass murder of their own people. It forces us to ask deeply uncomfortable questions about the lengths to which authority will go to enforce its will, and how easily atrocities can be justified in the name of law and order.
The government knew exactly what would happen when they ordered the inclusion of methanol in the commercial supply. The bootleggers were simply washing the industrial liquid, filtering out the foul tastes, and selling it to millions of thirsty citizens in speakeasies across the nation. It was a crisis. To fight back against this black market, the Treasury Department demanded stronger poisons. They mandated the addition of benzene, cadmium, and zinc. These were heavy metals and toxic compounds that could not be easily filtered out by the amateur chemists working for organized crime syndicates in the 20s. And this is where the story shifts from mere enforcement to active malice. The federal chemists were actively testing these new deadly formulas on laboratory animals. They documented the horrific effects, the blindness, the organ failure, and the excruciating pain. Then, they approved these exact formulas for distribution. Bootleggers tried to warn their customers. They employed their own sciences to try and crack the government codes, trying to find ways to neutralize the new poisons. But the federal government was always one step ahead, changing the poison formulas every few months to ensure maximum lethality everywhere. By Christmas of 1926, the crisis reached a horrifying peak. Hospitals in major cities were overwhelmed. In New York City alone, Bellevue Hospital saw over 100 patients admitted in a single day, all suffering from violent convulsions, total blindness, and complete respiratory failure from alcohol. Let us talk about what methanol actually does to the human body. Unlike regular ethanol, which the liver safely processes, methanol breaks down into formaldehyde and formic acid. It effectively embalms the victim from the inside out, destroying the optic nerve first, which is why blindness occurs first. Families watched in absolute terror as their loved ones collapsed after just one drink at a holiday party. The medical examiner of New York City, Charles Norris, realized exactly what was happening. He started conducting autopsies and holding press conferences, desperately trying to warn the public about poisons. Norris wrote frantic letters to the federal government. He accused them of deliberately murdering American citizens. His chief toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, isolated the specific chemicals in the victims to prove the government was responsible. But federal authorities dismissed their findings, claiming the bootleggers were entirely to blame now. The government response was incredibly cold. The Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Lincoln Andrews, publicly stated that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was a criminal and therefore deserved what happened to them. They viewed the poisoning not as a tragedy, but as a highly successful deterrent against crime. The anti-saloon league leaders fully supported this violent policy. They argued that a few thousand deaths were a small price to pay to enforce national morality. They actually lobbied Congress to increase the toxicity of the denaturing formulas, demanding the industrial alcohol be completely lethal upon consumption. Consider the tragic story of Arthur Miller, a young father from Chicago. He bought a bottle of what he thought was smuggled Canadian whiskey for his wedding anniversary. Within 4 hours of drinking it, his vision went entirely black. By the next morning, he was dead in bed. His story was not unique. In Philadelphia, entire speakeasies were found with patrons slumped over tables, dead before they could even finish their meals. The authorities tried to sweep these incidents under the rug, listing the causes of death as natural organ failure or poisoning rather than murder. Families were left utterly devastated, often too ashamed to come forward because drinking was illegal. This allowed the government to continue their silent genocide without massive public outcry. The true death toll will likely never be known, but conservative estimates place the absolute minimum at 10,000 citizens. 10,000 deaths. It is staggering. If any private corporation today knowingly put a lethal chemical into a widely consumed product, the executives would face life in prison or the death penalty. But because this was a federal mandate, protected by federal law, absolutely no one faced prosecution. Let us dive deeper into the specific formulas they used. The most infamous was formula number 3. It contained 4 parts methanol, 2 parts benzene, 1 part cadmium, and a dash of iodine to give it a foul metallic taste. Bootleggers managed to extract the iodine, ignoring benzene. Benzene is a powerful carcinogen. Even if a drinker survived the immediate methanol poisoning, the benzene would quietly ravage their bone marrow over the next decade. The government literally planted chemical time bombs in the bodies of thousands of citizens, ensuring that even moderate drinkers would suffer physical agony. When formula number 3 failed to stop the illegal liquor trade, the Treasury Department authorized the creation of formula number 5. This one was far more aggressive. It introduced brucine, an alkaloid closely related to strychnine. Brucine causes catastrophic muscle spasms, essentially suffocating victims as lungs completely paralyze. Strychnine derivatives are used as rat poison. That is exactly how the government viewed the American public. They viewed their own citizens as pests that needed to be eradicated for daring to consume alcohol. The utter lack of basic human empathy displayed by these policymakers is chilling to review. And we must talk about the organized crime syndicates. Al Capone and other infamous mobsters realized that selling deadly poison was actually bad for their long-term business. So in a twisted turn of historical irony, the ruthless mobsters actually tried to make alcohol safer than the government. The syndicates hired the best organic chemists that illicit money could buy. They set up massive underground renovation plants where they boiled the poisoned industrial alcohol, attempting to separate the lethal methanol from the drinkable ethanol. It was a massive technological arms race between criminals and angry federal scientists. But ethanol and methanol have incredibly similar boiling points. The criminal chemists could never perfectly separate them. They could only dilute the poison enough so that the drinker would just get violently ill instead of dying instantly. But over time, the trace amounts of methanol still permanently blind them. This led to the tragic phenomenon known as jakeleg. Thousands of Americans consumed heavily adulterated Jamaican ginger extract, which was another massive workaround during Prohibition. The government mandated the addition of neurotoxins to the extract, causing permanent paralysis in the legs of 50,000 rural American citizens. You can still hear old blues songs written about the jakeleg walk. Entire communities in the South had men shuffling down the street with paralyzed limbs, their lives completely destroyed by federal poison. It became a normalized tragedy, just another accepted risk of living in Prohibition-era America. The propaganda machine of the 1920s worked overtime to cover this up. The dry advocates heavily controlled the media narrative. Whenever the press reported on mass deaths at a speakeasy, the government spokesman blamed greedy criminals. They completely erased their documented role in intentionally formulating lethal chemicals. It was a classic disinformation campaign. Charles Norris, the brave medical examiner, paid out of his own pocket to publish reports exposing the federal poisoning. He famously wrote that the government had created a national experiment in extermination. But his urgent warnings were mostly ignored by national politicians. Let us not forget the profound class divide here. Wealthy Americans, including the politicians who wrote these laws, were drinking safe imported liquor from Europe or Canada. They had well-stocked private cellars. The poisoned industrial alcohol only targeted the poor, the working class, and marginalized immigrant communities.
Exactly. It was a form of chemical class warfare. A factory worker looking for a cheap drink on a Saturday night was effectively playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun provided by his own government. The wealthy elite suffered absolutely zero consequences from brutal enforcement tactics of the state. Decades later, when the history of Prohibition is taught in schools, we only hear about flappers, jazz music, and speakeasies. We hear fun stories about Eliot Ness and the Untouchables. We never hear about the 10,000 agonizing deaths caused by federal chemists poisoning the general American populace. Why did this cover-up succeed? Because acknowledging it destroys the myth of benevolent government regulation. When the 21st Amendment finally repealed Prohibition in 1933, the political establishment quietly closed the files on the poisoning program. No congressional hearings were held, no public apologies issued. The medical records and morgue files sat gathering dust in New York and Chicago basements for over 80 years. Historians only recently began piecing together the true scale of the massacre. Deborah Blum wrote extensively about Alexander Gettler, shining a crucial light on the forensic work that proved everything. Gettler essentially invented modern toxicology just to fight the federal government. He developed entirely new methods for detecting heavy metals in organic tissue. Because the government kept claiming victims died of natural causes, Gettler had to prove mathematically that lethal concentrations of federal methanol were present in every corpse. His meticulous lab notebooks are horrifying to read, page after page documenting the destruction of human tissue. And remember, the government had full access to these toxicology reports. They saw the scientific proof of their atrocities, and their response was to simply order more toxic formulas widely manufactured. This raises a massive philosophical question about modern justice. How can we legally define a crime when the perpetrator is the sovereign state? The officials who ordered the poisoning believed they were acting righteously. They justified mass murder as a necessary administrative tool to ensure total compliance with mandates. It is a terrifying precedent. If the government can legally poison a consumer product to punish citizens for noncompliance, what absolute limits actually exist on federal power? This is why exposing this hidden history is so fundamentally critical today. We must understand the lethal extremes of unrestrained moral crusades. Today, federal agencies are shielded by concepts like sovereign immunity. You can't easily sue the government for policy decisions, even if those decisions directly cause massive loss of life. The architects of the Prohibition poisoning program lived out their entire lives with prominent, respectable careers, retiring with generous pensions. Think about Lincoln Andrews, the Treasury official who spearheaded the aggressive denaturing program. He was praised as a strict law enforcement hero by conservative newspapers. No reporter ever asked him to answer for the thousands of young men and women who suffocated on blood due to his policies. It demonstrates a frightening psychological principle. When authorities label a specific group of people as criminals, in this case anyone who drank alcohol, society suddenly tolerates extreme violence against them. The victims are dehumanized. Their deaths are framed as suicides by bad choices, rather than state-sponsored mass homicide. We see echoes of this harsh rhetoric in modern drug policies. The idea that illicit drug users deserve tainted supplies or fatal overdoses is a direct descendant of the Prohibition poisoning logic. The federal government laid the absolute groundwork for weaponizing consumer product safety as a law enforcement weapon. Let us look at the ongoing legacy of the 10,000 victims. Many families lost their primary breadwinners to methanol poisoning. Children were thrown into complete poverty, forced into orphanages, or put to work in factories because their fathers drank a single poisoned glass of whiskey at a celebration. The generational trauma is completely unquantifiable. Imagine growing up knowing your father died, but the official records called it natural causes, while your community whispered that he was murdered by the Treasury Department. The sheer psychological weight of that collective gaslighting across thousands of affected families is truly profound.
And let us address the sheer hypocrisy of the medical establishment at the time. While Charles Norris fought valiantly, the American Medical Association remained largely silent. Many prominent doctors feared losing their federal licenses, so they quietly signed falsified death certificates, hiding the government poisoning behind false medical diagnoses. It proves that institutional complicity is required for mass atrocities. The government could not kill 10,000 citizens without the tacit cooperation of doctors, coroners, police officers, and journalists who chose to look the other way. They all prioritized maintaining social order over protecting the sanctity of human life. As we approach the end of this dark historical journey, we have to demand accountability from history itself. The textbooks must be rewritten. The Prohibition era was not just a failed social experiment. It was a period of active, unprosecuted state terrorism directed entirely against the American working class. We must continue to share these forgotten stories. Remembering the 10,000 victims of the federal alcohol poisoning program is the only justice they will ever receive. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of what happens when a powerful government decides that human lives are merely disposable leverage. Never forget their names, their families, or the truth. The American government intentionally poisoned 10,000 innocent citizens, and we will never forget.